The rope snapped clean and fast, the sound sharp enough to carry across the yard. And that was how the rancher knew this was not a mistake, but a decision already made by men who believed no answer would follow. The old horse lifted its head at once, ears forward, eyes alert despite the years in its joints. And when it was pulled toward the waiting riders, it did not resist so much as hesitate, as if expecting the man who had raised it to speak first. He did not. He stood where he was, boots planted in dust that had known his weight for decades, watching the riders move with the confidence of people who believed strength came from numbers and distance, rather than judgment. They did not rush. They did not hide. They took the horse in daylight, laughing once, loudly enough to be heard, because theft done openly was meant to be understood as warning as much as gain. One of them glanced back, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps hoping for it, but the rancher gave him nothing. No shout, no threat, not even the indignation that made men feel justified afterward. Instead, he stepped forward only after the dust settled, reached down, and lifted the broken end of the rope from the ground, turning it slowly in his hands, as if it were a clue, rather than an insult. The yard was quiet again, too quickly, the kind of quiet that tried to pretend nothing had changed. But the horse's absence reshaped everything it touched. The rancher walked the line they had taken, not chasing, not following blindly, but reading what had been left behind on purpose, and what had been left behind by carelessness, hoofprints cutting deeper where confidence had grown, boot marks that told him how many there were and how certain they felt. He went inside then, not to sit or curse fate, but to prepare with the same deliberate calm he had used all his life when a decision mattered. He chose supplies carefully, not weapons, not anything meant to threaten, but proof, things that spoke when words were challenged, then saddled his remaining horse with the ease of habit rather than urgency. Neighbors would later say he looked too calm, that a man who truly meant to reclaim what was his would have ridden harder or called for help, but they misunderstood the kind of resolve that did not burn hot and quick. By the time the sun climbed higher, the rancher was already on the move, riding toward land most men avoided unless they had reason, carrying with him only what he needed and leaving behind everything that would slow him. He did not wonder whether the tribe would deny him, nor whether he would be welcomed or turned away, because those questions belonged to men who arrived empty-handed. He rode knowing exactly where the tracks led and why, and with every mile he put behind him, one truth settled more firmly than anger ever could. The horse would not decide this day by force, and neither would he. But when the moment came to stand before those who had taken what was not theirs, he would arrive prepared, and the answer would be given where everyone could see it. The rancher did not ride fast, and that was the first thing that would have confused anyone watching him leave, because men driven by loss usually tried to erase distance instead of understanding it. But he had learned long ago that haste blurred details, and details decided outcomes. He followed the tracks only as far as he needed to confirm what he already suspected, then turned off deliberately, circling wide to gather what the riders had not thought to hide. Broken grass, where they had stopped to drink, a scrap of cloth snagged on mesquite. The clean print of the old horse's hoof impressed deeper than the others because of its weight and patience. These were not trophies, and not evidence meant for argument. They were assurances, quiet confirmations that he was not guessing his way into danger. Before leaving the edge of his land, he stopped once more at the creek crossing, where people naturally slowed, knelt, and pressed his palm into the mud beside the horse's mark, feeling the warmth still held there, and he allowed himself a single breath of certainty, because knowing where something had been was the first step toward knowing where it would end up. Back at the saddle, he adjusted the cinch, checked the reins, and made sure the small bundle tied behind him was balanced and secure, because preparation that announced itself often invited resistance, and he did not intend to arrive as a threat. What he carried was simple: tokens that proved ownership without accusation, markings that only he and the horse recognized, and one folded paper that mattered not for what it said, but for who would recognize its seal when the time came. He chose a route that avoided settlements and shortcuts, not because he feared being seen, but because the path itself needed to tell a consistent story, one that could be retraced without contradiction. As the land opened and then tightened again, the rancher measured distance by the horse's rhythm beneath him rather than by the sun, trusting experience over urgency. And with each mile the noise of the theft fell away, replaced by the clear, focused quiet that came when a man moved with purpose instead of reaction. He knew the tribe's boundary well enough to recognize it long before any marker appeared, the subtle shift in ground, the way paths converged and then narrowed, and he slowed further there, not out of respect alone, but out of strategy, because arriving calm was itself a form of preparation. By the time he crossed fully into territory most outsiders treated as forbidden, his mind was already settled on how the day would be faced, not with challenge, not with apology, but with clarity. He was not riding to accuse, and he was not riding to beg. He was riding to stand where questions were asked honestly and answered without noise. Whatever waited ahead, whether denial or dismissal, would be met with proof instead of temper, and as the distance behind him lengthened and the land ahead grew more watchful, the rancher carried with him the quiet advantage of a man who had taken the time to prepare not just his hands, but the ground on which he would be required to speak. By the time the rancher reached the edge of the land, most men pretended not to see. The tracks no longer needed reading, because everything about them pointed in the same direction with the confidence of people who had never expected to be questioned. The riders had stopped disguising their path, no longer cutting wide or avoiding hard ground, and that certainty told him more than caution ever could have, because only those who believed authority was already on their side moved without concern for witnesses. He slowed his horse to a measured walk, not out of fear, but because arrival mattered more than speed now, and the wrong kind of urgency could turn intention into provocation. The land itself shifted as he rode deeper, paths narrowing, trees growing closer together, and the air carrying the quiet weight of being watched without revealing from where, and he accepted it without tension, keeping his posture open, hands visible, eyes forward. He did not announce himself, but he did not hide either, understanding that respect in such places came from balance rather than boldness. When the first figures appeared ahead, standing where the trail bent toward open ground, they did not raise voices or weapons, only watched, and the rancher met their gaze calmly, slowing again until his horse stopped of its own accord, allowing the moment to settle instead of pushing through it. He spoke then, not to challenge or justify, but to state his purpose plainly, explaining that he followed tracks that led here and that he intended to speak with whoever held authority, because matters of ownership and honor were not settled by taking what could not be defended openly. The watchers listened without interruption, their expressions unreadable, then turned and gestured for him to follow, not as permission granted lightly, but as acknowledgement that the day would be handled where eyes could see it clearly. As he rode on, the settlement came into view gradually, not revealed all at once, and the rancher noted how deliberately it was placed. Paths arranged to control movement, open spaces kept clear to expose intention rather than hide it. People paused in their work to watch him pass, not with hostility, but with interest sharpened by the knowledge that an outsider rarely arrived alone and calm unless he carried something worth hearing. He felt the weight of that attention settle, not heavy enough to slow him, but firm enough to remind him that every step from this point forward would be remembered. At the center, Where the ground widened and voices carried cleanly, he was asked to wait, and he did so without dismounting, hands resting loose on the reins, posture steady, because impatience here would read as weakness rather than resolve. When the leader finally appeared, surrounded by quiet authority rather than noise, the rancher inclined his head slightly, neither bowing nor standing taller than necessary, and in that restrained gesture made clear that he had not come to provoke a tribe, but to stand before it honestly. The tracks had led him exactly where he expected, and as the murmurs settled and the space opened around them, the rancher understood that the moment for preparation had ended, and the moment for truth, spoken or shown, had begun. The leader did not speak at once, and the silence that followed the rancher's arrival was not empty, but deliberate, the kind used to measure a man before deciding what he was worth. The rancher waited without shifting, reins loose, shoulders relaxed, allowing the moment to take its shape, because rushing to explain before being asked often sounded like fear. Around them, the tribe formed a wide circle, not crowding, not withdrawing, their presence unified and watchful, and the weight of that attention pressed in without threat, making clear that this was not a place where raised voices settled anything. The leader stepped forward then, eyes steady, posture unyielding, and asked the question plainly, without accusation or softness, whether the horse taken that morning belonged to the man who stood before them. The rancher answered just as plainly, saying yes, not adding history, not offering proof yet, because truth spoken too defensively lost its strength. The leader studied him for a long moment, then gestured, and the old horse was led forward from the far side of the circle, its head lifting as it recognized the sound of the rancher's breathing before it ever saw his face. A murmur moved through the gathered people, not surprise, but attention sharpening, as the horse stepped closer on its own, ears forward, body angling instinctively toward the man who had raised it. The rancher did not reach out, did not call to it, only stood where he was, allowing the animal to choose without direction. And when the horse stopped beside him and pressed its muzzle briefly against his shoulder, the truth settled into the space more clearly than any argument could have. The leader watched closely, not the horse alone, but the rancher's restraint, the way he did not claim what was already choosing him, and something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, in the way authority weighed the moment. The leader raised a hand, and the murmurs stopped at once, then turned and spoke to those who had taken the horse, asking not why they thought they could steal, but why they believed no one would come prepared to answer them. The question carried no anger, only disappointment sharpened by expectation, and the men lowered their eyes, understanding too late that the matter had moved beyond defense. The leader ordered the horse returned immediately, his voice calm and final, and the command rippled outward without resistance, because leadership here did not need repetition. The rancher accepted the reins without ceremony, nodding once in acknowledgement rather than triumph, and as the circle loosened slightly, he sensed that the day had already changed course. What remained was not whether the horse would go home, but how the truth of this moment would be carried forward. And as the leader turned his attention back to the men who had taken what was not theirs, the rancher understood that judgment, once spoken in daylight, rarely stopped at the first question it asked. The moment did not end when the reins changed hands, because truth, once revealed, rarely stopped moving where people were gathered to witness it, and the old horse made that clear by refusing to be hurried away. It stood beside the rancher with a steadiness that came from long familiarity, not fear, shifting its weight to match his stance as if years of shared ground had taught it where safety lived. The rancher rested one hand lightly against its neck. Then, not to display ownership, but to acknowledge choice, and the simple gesture carried farther than any claim spoken aloud. Around them, the circle tightened and then eased, people leaning forward before catching themselves, because animals did not perform loyalty for strangers, and what they had just seen could not be coached or forced. The leader's gaze moved from the horse to the rancher, and back again, measuring not only what had been proven, but how it had been allowed to prove itself, and the silence that followed deepened with understanding rather than doubt. One of the men who had taken the horse shifted his feet and began to speak, offering reasons that sounded smaller the moment they left his mouth, and the leader cut him off with a raised hand, not out of anger, but because explanation after recognition only cheapened what had already been decided. He asked the rancher then whether there was anything else he wished to add before judgment was given, and the rancher answered honestly that there was not, because what mattered had already been shown without being pushed. That restraint drew another murmur through the gathered people, quieter this time, edged with respect, because a man who could press advantage and chose not to was rare in any place governed by strength. The leader nodded once, slow and deliberate, and addressed the circle, naming the act for what it was, taking without right, assuming silence where responsibility should have been expected, and in doing so made clear that authority here was not threatened by being corrected, only strengthened by it. The old horse lifted its head then and blew softly through its nostrils, a sound familiar enough to the rancher to settle his breathing, and the small human response to that sound did not go unnoticed. Eyes followed the movement, some curious, some thoughtful, as the truth of the bond filled the space left by accusation. The leader gestured again, this time not toward the horse but toward the men who had taken it, and the tone of the gathering shifted fully, from spectacle to consequence, because recognition carried responsibility with it. As the rancher waited, posture unchanged, he understood that this was the fulcrum of the day, not the recovery of what had been stolen, but the moment when proof had been allowed to speak first. And in that allowance, everyone present had been reminded that justice, when it arrived without noise, left very little room to argue against it. The leader did not raise his voice when he spoke next, and that alone carried enough weight to still every movement in the circle, because commands given without force were understood to be final. He turned toward the men who had taken the horse and asked them to step forward, not as an accusation, but as a requirement. And when they did, their confidence had already thinned into something closer to unease. The leader reminded them that strength did not excuse taking what could not be defended openly, and that assuming an outsider would remain silent was not courage, but laziness disguised as certainty. His words were measured, not meant to wound, but to draw a line that could not be mistaken. And as he spoke, the rancher noticed how the people around them listened not out of fear, but expectation, because authority here rested on consistency rather than intimidation. The leader ordered the horse returned fully, not just released, but acknowledged as belonging to the man it had chosen, and the reins were placed into the rancher's hands again, this time with a nod that carried recognition rather than correction. Then the leader addressed the theft itself, stating plainly that actions taken without right carried consequence, and he named the punishment that would follow, not in anger, but in restoration, a sentence meant to remind rather than break. A low murmur moved through the gathered people, not in protest, but acceptance, because the rule had been applied without exception. The men who had stolen the horse lowered their heads, understanding that the day would not end with dismissal, and the weight of that realization settled heavily on their shoulders. It was then that the rancher stepped forward, breaking the expected order of things, and the movement drew every eye at once, because intervention at such a moment was rare and rarely welcome. He spoke calmly, asking that the punishment be set aside, not denied but forgiven, explaining that what had been taken had been returned, and that the lesson had already been learned in front of witnesses. The request landed in the circle like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of surprise outward, because mercy offered where consequence was deserved unsettled assumptions on every side. The leader studied the rancher closely, not searching for weakness, but for motive, and found neither apology nor demand in his posture, only a deliberate choice to end the matter without adding weight to it. After a long pause, the leader raised his hand again, and the circle fell silent, and he acknowledged the request not as submission, but as authority meeting authority on moral ground. He withdrew the punishment, stating that mercy, when chosen freely, strengthened order rather than weakened it, and in doing so shifted the tone of the day from correction to respect. As the people absorbed the decision, the rancher felt the moment settle into something solid and lasting. Because the order that had changed the day was not the return of the horse, but the recognition that restraint, when practiced openly, could command as much respect as power ever had. The change in the circle did not go unnoticed, especially by the one who had been standing just beyond it, quiet and still, watching the exchange without drawing attention to herself. The leader's daughter had seen the rancher arrive, had measured his calm against the tension that followed him, and now watched the way mercy reshaped the space where punishment had been expected. She did not look at him the way others did, not with curiosity or calculation, but with a steady interest that came from recognizing something rare, a man who had held advantage and released it without being asked. As the leader lowered his hand, and the people began to breathe again, her gaze remained fixed on the rancher, taking in the way he stood neither taller nor smaller for what he had just done, as if the act of mercy had not changed who he was, only revealed it more clearly. The rancher felt the attention without turning, aware that moments like this created stories that lasted longer than conflict, and he kept his posture unchanged, not seeking acknowledgement, not retreating from it either. The daughter stepped closer then, not into the center of the circle but near enough that her presence was felt, and the subtle shift drew the leader's eye at once, because he knew the weight of what she noticed and why it mattered. She spoke quietly to him, not questioning the decision, but naming what she had seen. The courage it took to come alone, the discipline it took to prepare without threatening, and the strength it took to forgive publicly. The leader listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but the people closest to him saw the moment for what it was, because a leader's regard changed when his children recognized honor before he named it himself. The rancher turned then, finally meeting her gaze, and inclined his head slightly, the same restrained acknowledgement he had offered her father, and the respect in that small gesture settled something between them without needing explanation. She did not smile, but there was a lightening in her eyes, a quiet approval that did not seek permission. And the rancher understood that he was being seen not as an outsider who had come to reclaim property, but as a man who had revealed his character when it would have been easier to hide behind outcome. The leader looked from his daughter to the rancher and back again, and the connection did not escape him, not because it was romantic yet, but because it carried the unmistakable shape of alignment, values meeting without negotiation. As the circle began to loosen and people returned to their places, the leader remained still, thoughtful, weighing not only the resolution of the theft, but the possibility that something more durable had been revealed in the way the day had been handled. The rancher prepared to leave then, reins in hand, believing his role finished, unaware that the decision forming behind him was not about what had been taken or returned, but about what kind of future could be built when strength, mercy, and respect were allowed to stand together without challenge. The leader did not call the rancher back right away, and that delay mattered, because decisions of weight were not made in the open or in haste, but in the space where intention could be tested without audience. The rancher had nearly turned his horse toward the trail when the leader stepped forward again, not raising his voice, not signaling urgency, only asking him to remain a moment longer, and the request carried respect rather than command. The circle did not close this time. Instead, it widened, creating room for a different kind of exchange, one that was not about judgment or proof, but about understanding. The leader spoke of the horse briefly, acknowledging its return as settled, then shifted to the act that had followed it. The mercy offered where consequence had been expected. And he asked the rancher why he had chosen forgiveness when no one would have faulted him for allowing punishment to stand. The rancher answered without rehearsed wisdom, saying only that loss did not always require payment to be real, and that some lessons stayed longer when they were not tied to pain. The simplicity of the answer moved through the gathered people quietly, because it left no space for argument, only reflection. The leader's daughter stood nearby, listening closely, and when the leader looked to her, she met his gaze without hesitation, confirming what he already understood, that what had just been demonstrated aligned with the values he wished to protect, not weaken. The leader nodded once, slowly, and in that movement the air changed again, not with tension, but with possibility. He spoke then of alliances built not through force, but through trust, of boundaries that held longer when respect crossed them freely. And he did so not as a proposal yet, but as a test of shared ground. The rancher listened, recognizing the weight beneath the words, and did not rush to fill the space, because he understood that some questions were being asked without being spoken. Around them, the people watched with a different attention now, not waiting for conflict, but for direction, and the leader allowed that attention to settle before making his intent clear. He told the rancher that a man who arrived prepared but chose mercy had shown the kind of strength that lasted beyond a single day, and that such strength was rare enough to be considered carefully. The rancher inclined his head again, neither accepting praise nor deflecting it, and the exchange closed without declaration, but with understanding placed firmly between them. When the rancher finally turned to leave, the leader's daughter watched him go with a steadiness that held more than curiosity, and the leader remained where he was, certain now that the resolution of the theft had been only the beginning of a larger decision, one that would be made not in anger or haste, but with the same deliberate care the rancher himself had brought to this day. The message reached the rancher before nightfall, not carried by urgency or demand, but by invitation, and the difference mattered enough that he accepted without suspicion. He returned to the edge of the settlement as the light softened, guided this time not by tracks or proof, but by recognition, and when he dismounted, he was met without ceremony, led to the same open ground where the circle had stood earlier, now cleared and quiet. The leader waited there with his daughter beside him, neither armed nor guarded, and the choice of setting made clear that what followed was not judgment or negotiation, but something that required daylight and witnesses only in memory. The leader spoke directly, acknowledging the rancher's return not as obligation, but as respect, and then named what had formed in him since the moment mercy was offered. That a man who could reclaim what was his without humiliation and end conflict without weakness carried the kind of strength that did not fracture people around him. He did not disguise his intent behind ceremony. He stated it plainly, saying that such strength belonged at the center of a household, and that he wished his daughter to choose a life beside a man who had proven he could protect without dominating. The words settled heavily, not because they were sudden, but because they were deliberate, and the rancher took a long moment before answering, understanding that this was not a reward, but a responsibility offered openly. He looked to the daughter then, not to claim her silence as consent, but to acknowledge her presence as equal in what was being proposed. And she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, neither shy nor pressured. The leader waited without interruption, and the people nearby did not speak, because this was not a decision that belonged to the crowd. The rancher answered carefully, saying that he would not accept a bond formed from gratitude alone, nor one that asked her to leave her people without choice, but that if the proposal was made with dignity and consent, he would consider it fully. The leader nodded, satisfied, and stated that the choice would be hers, uncoerced, and that no alliance built on force lasted long enough to matter. The daughter stepped forward then and spoke for herself, saying she had seen enough to know the man before her did not mistake silence for weakness or mercy for indecision, and that such clarity was worth walking toward. The agreement was sealed not with celebration, but with understanding, and as the evening settled around them, the rancher felt the day complete itself in an unexpected way, because what had begun as a theft had ended not only in resolution, but in the opening of a future he had not come prepared to claim, yet found himself willing to protect with the same restraint that had brought him there. The wedding did not arrive as spectacle, but as intention made visible, unfolding over a full day in a way that honored both where it began and what it joined together, and the rancher understood from the first moment that this was not a reward for restraint, but a recognition of it. The celebration took place in open ground where the land itself could witness it, fires set wide, music steady rather than loud, and people gathered not out of obligation but agreement, because alliances formed without force carried a different weight. The rancher stood beside the leader's daughter with the same quiet composure he had shown the day he arrived to reclaim his horse, not performing happiness, but grounded in it, and she met the moment with equal steadiness, her choice clear and unpressured. When the leader spoke, his words were brief, acknowledging what had been proven rather than promising what could not be guaranteed, and when the people answered, it was with approval rather than awe, because they understood that respect earned openly lasted longer than celebration. The old horse was brought forward during the gathering, not decorated, not displayed, but present, and when it stood calmly near the couple, a murmur moved through those watching, because they recognized the symbol without needing it explained. The beginning and the bridge were the same. The next morning, before the heat rose and before farewells could stretch into ceremony, the rancher prepared to leave with his bride, not as an outsider taking something away, but as a man welcomed to return with what had been freely given. The leader walked with them to the edge of the settlement, not offering warnings or conditions, only a final look that held trust without surrender, and his daughter embraced him once before turning toward the life she had chosen. The ride back was unhurried, the land opening gradually as if acknowledging the change, and when the ranch came into view, it did not feel smaller for having been left, but fuller for what now approached it. Days settled into rhythm again. Work shared, ground tended, meals taken without urgency, and the quiet life that followed did not erase what had come before, but placed it where it belonged, as foundation rather than burden. The rancher did not speak often of the day his horse was taken, nor of the choice that followed it, because the lesson did not require retelling. It lived instead in how boundaries were held, how mercy was practiced, and how respect traveled without needing escort. And in that life, built not on victory, but on peace chosen deliberately, the rancher understood that some beginnings arrived disguised as loss, and that when met with preparation rather than anger, they could open a future strong enough to last without ever needing to be defended again. They expected anger. They weren't ready for preparation. Do you think mercy is a weakness or the strongest form of control? The decision is yours. Like the video, and subscribe the Native American Tales channel for more cinematic videos.